The ship was quiet in the way that only deep space could make things quiet. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of something vast and endless, pressing against the hull from every direction. The gentle orbit drifted through the nebula corridor like a silver fish swimming through colored smoke, and most of the crew had already gone to their rest chambers hours ago, leaving the hallways dim and the consoles running on automatic. In the lower observation bay, where the curved window showed nothing but swirling clouds of violet and gold gas, a single human sat at her workstation, with her boots propped on the edge of the console, and a cold cup of synthetic coffee balanced on her knee. Her name was Elise Marin, and she was a xenobiologist, which meant that on most days, her job involved cataloging alien plant samples and writing reports that nobody read. But tonight, she had volunteered to run the sensor recalibration because nobody else wanted to sit through 8 hours of watching numbers crawl across a screen. She did not mind the work, and she did not mind the quiet, and she especially did not mind being alone, because there was something about the night shift that felt honest in a way the day shift never did. Up on the bridge, Commander Yishra was running the overnight watch with 2 junior officers, and Captain Vaughn was sealed in his rest pod, where the Sulinis slept standing upright, like strange tall insects frozen in amber. And the rest of the crew, Prillians, Delphani, Velhari, and a handful of others, were all tucked away in whatever version of sleep their biology demanded. Humans were the only species on board that could choose not to sleep and still function, and Elise had been making that choice for most of her adult life. She tapped a command into the console and watched a new wave of data scroll past, each line representing a tiny slice of the nebula outside, measured and translated into numbers that the ship could understand. The work was boring, and that was fine. She heard them before she saw them, the soft padding of large paws on the metal floor, the kind of sound that was trying very hard to be sneaky, but was not quite managing it. Elise turned her chair slowly and looked toward the doorway. 3 shapes stood there, huddled together, their big round eyes catching the blue light of the console and reflecting it back like small moons. They were Velhari cubs, Ruck, Senna, and Tal, Commander Yishra's children, and they were supposed to be in their family quarters, sleeping under the thermal netting that their mother had set up for them before her shift began. Ruck was the oldest, at what humans would call 8 years old, though in Velhari terms he was barely past his first growth cycle, and he stood a full head taller than Elise, even at that age, because the Velhari were a large species built like bears crossed with wolves, covered in thick dark fur that shifted between brown and deep blue depending on the light. Senna was the middle child, quieter than her brother, with silver-tipped ears that twitched at every small sound, and Tal was the youngest, barely old enough to speak full sentences in common, round and soft, and still carrying the baby fat that Velhari cubs kept until their second cycle. They looked at Elise with wide, uncertain eyes, and she looked back at them, and nobody said anything for a long moment. "Cannot sleep," Ruck finally said in his careful, broken common, the words coming out slow and heavy, like stones dropped into water. Elise nodded and gestured to the open floor space beside her console, where the heating panels kept the metal warm. "Come sit down, then," she said, keeping her voice low and easy, the way she always did when she talked to them. The cubs padded forward, their claws clicking softly on the floor, and they arranged themselves in the way that Velhari young always did when they were seeking comfort, pressed together in a pile, with the youngest in the middle and the oldest on the outside, facing the door. Elise had read about this behavior in her xenobiology studies, but seeing it in person was different from reading about it, because the textbooks never mentioned how the cubs would look up at whoever was nearby with that specific expression that was not quite trust and not quite need, but something in between that had no name in any language she knew. The colors outside, make my head feel strange, Senna whispered, and Elise understood. The nebulous ambient radiation had been bothering several species on board for days now. Mild headaches for the Prillians, irritability for the Delphani, a general sense of unease that the ship's medical officer had called subclinical distress, which was a fancy way of saying everyone felt bad, but not bad enough to do anything about it. The cubs were young, and their nervous systems were still developing. They felt everything more sharply than the adults did. I know, Elise said, and she meant it, because she felt it too in her own human way. A low hum at the back of her skull, like a sound she could almost hear, but not quite. She reached under her console and pulled out the emergency thermal blanket she kept there for long shifts, and she unfolded it and draped it over the 3 cubs, tucking the edges around Tal, who had already closed his eyes and pressed his face into his sister's fur. "What are you doing?" Rock asked, watching the scrolling data on her screen with the curiosity that all young things carried. "Fixing the ship's eyes," Elise said, which was close enough to the truth, and Ruck seemed satisfied with that answer, because he lowered his heavy head onto his front paws and let out a long breath that fogged in the cool air of the observation bay. Elise turned back to her console and kept working. The minutes passed, and the data scrolled, and the nebula outside shifted its colors like a sleeping animal turning in a dream. And one by one, the cubs fell asleep, their breathing falling into a shared rhythm the way Valhari always synchronized when they felt safe. Elise listened to that breathing and felt something in her chest that she could not name. Not quite sadness and not quite joy, but something warm and heavy that sat behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. She kept working. At 0347 ship time, a number appeared on her screen that did not belong there. It was small and easy to miss, just a slight variation in the background radiation pattern, a pulse where there should have been static. But Elise had been staring at these readings for 5 hours, and she knew what normal looked like, and this was not normal. She leaned forward and ran the reading again. The pulse repeated, faint but structured, too regular to be natural, too buried in the nebula's noise to be accidental. There, in the colored fog, was sending a signal. Elise flagged the reading and tagged it for review, and set up an automated tracker to log every repetition. And then she sat back in her chair and looked at the sleeping cubs, and looked at the nebula outside the window, and felt the first cold finger of something that was not quite fear, but was certainly its neighbor, press against the back of her neck. She did not wake anyone. She did not sound any alarm. She simply turned back to her console and kept watching and kept working, because that was what humans did when they were afraid. They did not stop. They did not shut down. They just kept going and going and going until the fear either proved itself right or went away. The cubs slept on, warm and safe beside her console, and Elise remained up through the long, quiet night, with the pulse blinking on her screen like a heartbeat in the dark. The day shift came alive the way it always did, lights brightening from blue to white in a slow wave through the corridors, the hum of air recyclers shifting to a higher setting, and the sound of dozens of species waking up and moving and talking in a mix of languages that blurred together into a kind of music that only starships could make. Elise had not slept. She had spent the remaining hours of the night shift tracking the anomalous pulse, logging each repetition, measuring the intervals between signals, and running the data through every filter the secondary console could handle. By the time the corridor lights turned white, she had 17 hours of logged readings and a preliminary analysis that she had organized into a clean report, and her coffee cup had been refilled 4 times, and her eyes burned in a way that only a full night without rest could produce. She saved her work and stretched her arms above her head and listened to her spine pop in. 3 places, and then she looked down at the cubs. They were still sleeping. Ruck was on his back, with all four paws in the air, like an overturned table, and Senna had rolled onto her side, with her silver-tipped ears folded flat against her skull. And Tal had somehow migrated during the night, until he was pressed directly against the leg of Elise's chair, his small warm body rising and falling with each breath. Elise watched them for a moment, and then she heard the heavy footsteps she had been expecting. Commander Yishra appeared in the doorway of the observation bay, still wearing her bridge uniform, her dark fur groomed, and her amber eyes sharp, despite her own long shift. And she stopped when she saw her 3 cubs sleeping in a pile around a human's workstation. Yishra looked at Elise, and Elise looked at Yishra, and neither of them spoke for a few seconds. "They came to me around midnight," Elise said quietly. "The nebula was keeping them." Yishra walked forward, slowly, and crouched beside her cubs, and touched each of them gently on the head, a gesture that Elise knew was deeply significant in Velhari culture, a parent confirming that their young were alive and whole, a habit that came from ancient days on their homeworld, when the nights were dangerous and morning was never guaranteed. "They have not slept through a full cycle since we entered this nebula," Yishra said, and her voice carried something that Elise could not quite read, surprise maybe, or something softer. "They are good kids," Elise said, and Yishra looked at her with those amber eyes and seemed to want to say something more, but instead she simply nodded and gathered her cubs, waking them gently and herding them toward the door with soft Velhari words that Elise did not understand, but could feel the warmth of. After they were gone, Elise picked up her datapad with the anomaly report and headed for the bridge. The gentle orbit was a wide oval room with stations arranged in a half-circle around the central command chair, where Captain Vaughn sat like a tall, thin statue made of dark green chitin, his compound eyes processing information from 6 different screens simultaneously, in the way that only the Sulini could manage. Lieutenant Faish was at the communications console, his small avian body perched on the elevated chair that had been custom-built for his species, his feathers a nervous shade of orange that shifted toward yellow whenever he was agitated, which was most of the time. Dr. Ossar stood at the science station, his Prillian skin glistening with the moisture that his species needed to stay comfortable in the dry ship air, his 4-fingered hands moving across his console with the slow, deliberate grace that made everything Prillians did look like an underwater dance. Elise walked in, and every head turned toward her because humans on the bridge during the day shift was unusual, and a human on the bridge who looked like she had not slept in 20 hours was even more unusual. "Captain," Elise said, keeping her voice even and professional, "I flagged an anomalous reading during the night shift, and I would like to present my findings." Vaughn's compound eyes shifted their focus to her, and he made the small clicking sound that was the Sulini equivalent of raised eyebrows. "Proceed," he said. Elise transferred her report to the main display and walked the bridge crew through it. The repeating pulse, the structured intervals, the fact that it did not match any known natural phenomenon in the Union's nebula database, and the fact that it appeared to be moving. When she finished, there was a silence on the bridge that lasted exactly 4 seconds before Lieutenant Faish broke it. "Sensor echo," he said, his feathers flattening in the way that meant he had already made up his mind. "The nebula density creates reflections in our scanning array. We have documented this 3 times already during this mission," Elise said calmly. "This signal does not match any of the recorded reflections. The interval structure is too regular, and it shifts position between readings in a way that echo artifacts do not." Dr. Ossar leaned forward at his station and pulled up her data on his own screen and studied it with the quiet intensity that Prillians brought to everything. "It could be a derelict probe," he said after a moment, "or debris with a residual transponder. The nebula is old enough to have collected artifacts from earlier exploration periods." That is possible, Elise admitted. But the signal is strengthening over time, which would not happen with passive debris, unless the debris is moving toward us. Captain Vaughn was quiet through all of this, processing in the way the Sulini always did, gathering every piece of information before forming a conclusion. Conclusion. Your recommendation, he said finally. I would like permission to continue monitoring through the next night cycle, Elise said. On my own time, using the secondary console in the observation bay. Faish made a sharp chirping sound that was his species' version of an incredulous laugh. You want to stay awake another full night for a probable ghost signal? He said, and the way he said it made it clear he thought this was a peculiar kind of human foolishness. Yes, Elise said simply. Vaughn studied her for a moment longer, and then nodded. Granted, he said. Report any significant changes immediately. Elise thanked him and left the bridge, and she could feel the weight of their eyes on her back as she walked out. Curiosity and confusion, and something that in most species translated roughly to the same thought. Why would anyone choose to lose sleep over something that was probably nothing? She went to the mess hall and ate a meal that she did not taste, and drank more coffee, and then she went to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bunk, and stared at the wall, and did not sleep, because she could not stop thinking about that pulse. At 1400 hours there was a knock at her door, and when she opened it, Commander Yishra was standing in the corridor, looking at her with an expression that Elise had learned to recognize as the Velhari way of approaching something important, sideways. My cubs, Yishra said. They are fine, Elise said. They just needed somewhere warm to sleep. Yishra shook her head slowly. You do not understand, she said. Velhari cubs do not sleep near strangers. They do not sleep near anyone outside their family pack, unless they feel something that we call reshka in our language. The closest translation in common would be bone-deep safety, the sense that a person would stand between them and danger without hesitation. Said nothing. My cubs chose to sleep beside you, Yishra continued. They have not done that with any other crew member in 3 years aboard this ship. She paused, and her amber eyes were very steady. I wanted you to know that this means something. Then she turned and walked away down the corridor, and Elise stood in her doorway and felt that warm, heavy thing behind her ribs again. That night at 2200 hours, Elise returned to the observation bay and powered up her console and began her second night of tracking the anomalous signal. At 2230 hours, the cubs appeared in the doorway again, Ruck first, then Senna, then Tal trailing behind on his short legs, and they padded across the floor and settled around her station without a word, finding their same spots as if they had been assigned seats, and Elise covered them with the thermal blanket and turned back to her screen. By 0300 hours, the signal had tripled in strength. By 0400 hours, Elise had confirmed that it was not debris, not a probe, not an echo. It was something very large, and it was getting closer, and it was coming for them. She sat in the blue light of her console, with 3 sleeping cubs pressed against her legs, and she felt the fear settle into her bones like cold water, and she kept working, because that was the only thing she knew how to do. The identification came at 0437 hours, and it came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, terrible certainty that built piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself in the dark. Elise had spent the last 2 hours pulling apart the signal's frequency structure, comparing it against the Galactic Union's threat database, a massive archive that every Union vessel carried in its memory banks, updated at every port of call, containing the known signatures of every species and vessel type that the Union had ever encountered or heard rumors of. Most of the entries were friendly or neutral, trade vessels and science ships and diplomatic carriers belonging to the hundreds of species that made up the Union's vast network of cooperation. Some entries were marked in amber, meaning caution, meaning keep your distance, but do not assume hostility. And a very small number of entries were marked in red, and the red entries had a special note attached that read in plain, Language. If you detect this signature, do not attempt contact. Do not hold position. Leave the area immediately and report to the nearest Union command station. The signal matched a red entry. Vorathai Drift Harvester. Elise read the entry 3 times because she wanted to be wrong, and she was not wrong. The Vorathai were a species that the Union had last made contact with 214 years ago, and that contact had ended with the complete destruction of a Union survey fleet. 11 ships, 4,000 crew, gone in a single encounter that had lasted less than 6 hours. The Vorathai did not communicate, did not negotiate, did not recognize other species as anything other than raw material. And their drift harvesters were the tools of their trade, massive automated vessels that moved through deep space like great slow predators, herding smaller ships into dead zones where escape was impossible before moving in to strip them down to their component atoms. The entry included a behavioral profile that Elise read with growing horror. Drift harvesters did not chase, the profile said. They guided, using subtle gravitational pulses to influence the navigation systems of target vessels, nudging them off course by fractions of a degree over days or weeks. So gently that the target's own computers would classify the drift as natural and autocorrect into the path the harvester wanted them to follow. Elise pulled up the Gentle Orbit's navigation logs for the past 10 days. The ship had made 14 automatic course corrections during that period, each one small, each one within normal drift tolerances, each one logged by the navigation AI as routine. And when Elise plotted them together on a chart, the pattern was obvious. They were not random corrections for natural drift. They were a slow, deliberate curve that was bending the ship's path deeper and deeper into the nebula. Next, and traced their projected course forward, and her stomach dropped. 14 hours from now, at their current heading, the Gentle Orbit would enter a section of the nebula that the map labeled as a high-density pocket. A region where the particle concentration was so thick that the ship's FTL drive could not generate a stable field, which meant no jump, which meant no escape, which meant they would be sitting still in a cloud of fog while something very large and very hungry came to take them apart. The drift harvester would arrive approximately 2 hours after that. Elise sat back in her chair and closed her eyes, and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was a child afraid of thunderstorms. And the breathing helped, because it always helped. And when she opened her eyes again, the fear was still there, but it was sitting in a corner of her mind instead of filling the whole room. Hours. She got to work. The problem was the navigation AI. It had been compromised, not by any kind of hack or intrusion, but simply by the harvester's gravitational pulses, which the AI interpreted as natural phenomena and responded to accordingly. And every time Elise tried to plot an alternative course, the AI would flag it as suboptimal and suggest corrections that would put them right back on the path to the dead zone. She could not override the AI from the secondary console, because that required bridge-level authorization that she did not have, which meant she had to do something harder. She had to calculate an escape trajectory manually, using raw math and her own understanding of stellar mechanics. And she had to make it good enough that when she presented it to the captain, there would be no room for doubt. The nebula was dense and chaotic and full of gravitational anomalies that made traditional navigation almost impossible. But Elise was stubborn, and she was scared, and those two things together made her very focused. She found her answer at 0612 hours, in the form of a stellar fragment. A chunk of collapsed star matter, buried deep in the nebula, dense enough to have its own significant gravity well, sitting at a position that was almost, but not quite, on their current path. If the Gentle Orbit could reach that fragment, and execute a precisely timed engine burn at the right angle, the fragment's gravity would sling them out of the nebula on a vector that pointed away from the dead zone and away from the harvester, and toward open space where they could make an FTL jump. The maneuver would be brutal, The kind of thing that test pilots did in simulations and shook their heads at afterward. And it would burn out at least half of the ship's sensor arrays and push the structural integrity of the hull to the edge of its tolerances, and require a level of real-time navigational precision that the compromised AI could not provide. Someone would have to fly it by hand. Or rather, someone would have to sit at a console and feed continuous recalculations to the helm officer, because the math would be changing every second as they moved through the gravity well. And the person doing that math would need to be fast and accurate and tireless. Elise began running simulations. She ran 47 of them over the next 3 hours, adjusting variables, testing failure points, finding the narrow window where the timing worked and the hull held and the engines did not burn out. And by the time she had a viable trajectory confirmed, she had been awake for over 24 hours, and her hands were shaking from caffeine and exhaustion, and something that was not quite adrenaline, but was close. Behind her, Rook stirred. The oldest cub lifted his heavy head from his paws, and blinked his large eyes in the blue console light, and looked at Elise with the quiet attention that Velhari cubs gave to things they were trying to understand. "You are still here," he said, and it was not a question. "I am still here," Elise said. "Are you scared?" he asked. Elise looked at him, at this child who was not her species, not her family, not her responsibility by any rule or law, but who had chosen to sleep beside her in the dark, because some part of him that was older than language had decided she was safe, and she told him the truth. "A little," she said, "but I am going to fix it." Ruck looked at her for a long moment, and his ears rotated forward in the Velhari expression that meant trust or acceptance or something between the two, and then he lowered his head back onto his paws and closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Elise turned back to her console and compiled her data into a report, and organized it and checked it again, and then she saved it to her datapad and sat back and waited. The day shift would begin in 90 minutes. She would not sleep. She would sit here with 3 alien children curled warm against her legs, and she would wait, and she would be ready, because the gentle orbit had 340 souls on board, and every single one of them was asleep right now, and someone had to be awake for them. Someone had to keep watch. That was what humans did, not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the smartest species in the galaxy, but because they were the ones who could choose to stay awake when their bodies screamed for rest. And they were the ones who would make that choice again and again and again, for the simple reason that someone they cared about needed them to. Elise waited, and the nebula swirled outside the window, and the pulse on her screen beat like the heart of something enormous and patient and hungry. And the cubs slept on. Elise walked onto the bridge at 0800 hours, and every person on the day shift saw 2 things about her at the same time. The dark circles under her eyes that told them she had not slept, and the way she held her datapad in both hands like it was something heavy and breakable and important. Captain Vaughn was in his command chair, and his compound eyes tracked her as she entered, and she could see the micro-movements of his mandibles. That meant the Sulini was processing her appearance and drawing conclusions from it. Lieutenant Faish looked up from this communications console, and his feathers shifted to an annoyed orange, because the human was back again with her ghost signal. And Dr. Asar turned from the science station with the slow, patient curiosity that was his species' default expression. Commander Yishra was standing at the tactical display near the back of the bridge, and she said nothing, but her amber eyes followed Elise across the room with an intensity that felt like a hand pressed flat against a window. "Captain," Elise said, and her voice was steady despite everything, "I need to present an emergency finding. I believe this ship is in immediate danger." The word immediate changed the temperature of the room. Vaughn made a single sharp click that silenced the low chatter from the junior officers, and he said, "Proceed," in the flat tone that the Sulini used when they were clearing space in their minds for something that mattered. Elise transferred her report to the main display, and the bridge crew saw what she had spent 2 nights building. The signal analysis, the frequency match to the Vorathi Drift Harvester entry, the navigation log showing the pattern of course corrections, the projected path into the dead zone, and the timeline. 14 hours to the trap, 16 hours to the harvester. She laid it out piece by piece, in simple, clear language, not because she thought they were stupid, but because she understood that fear needed simplicity to be heard. And when she finished, the bridge was so quiet that she could hear the hum of the deck plating beneath her feet. Lieutenant Feishi's feathers had gone white, pure white, which Elise had never seen before, and which she later learned was the Dothani panic response, the color their ancestors had turned when predators found their nests. Dr. Ossar had gone very still in the way that Prillians did when their bodies were preparing for rapid action, his skin glistening brighter as moisture flooded his pores. Captain Vaughn's compound eyes cycled through 3 different configurations in rapid succession, a display that Elise's xenobiology training told her was the Sulini equivalent of shock, followed by denial, followed by acceptance, all compressed into the space of 2 seconds, because the Sulini did not waste time on emotions they could not use. "You are certain," Vaughn said. "I have run 47 simulations," said. "The signal matches the Vorathi Drift Harvester profile, with a confidence of 98%. And our course correction pattern matches the herding behavior described in the Union Threat Database exactly." The silence stretched again, and then Commander Yishra stepped forward from the tactical display, and her voice cut through the bridge like a blade through cloth. "The human remained up all night while we slept," she said, and every head turned toward her. She remained up for 2 nights, alone at her console in the observation bay, tracking this threat, while the rest of us dismissed her first report as sensor noise. Yishra looked directly at Captain Vaughn. "My cubs slept beside her, Captain, and Volhari cubs do not sleep beside anyone they do not trust with their lives. I suggest we extend the same trust." The words landed in the room, and sat there with a weight that Elise could feel in her chest. Vaughn was quiet for 3 seconds, an eternity by Sulini. Processing standards, and then he stood from his command chair, and his full height of 7 feet filled the center of the bridge like a pillar. "All stations to alert status," he said. "Navigation, hold current course, and await manual override. Commander Yishra, move all non-essential personnel and dependents to the secure bay. Dr. Marin," and he turned his compound eyes to Elise, and she saw something in those multifaceted surfaces that she had never seen a Sulini direct at a human before, something that looked very much like respect. "Present your escape trajectory." Elise pulled up the slingshot maneuver on the main display and explained it. The stellar fragment, the gravity well, the precise engine burn, the manual recalculations that would need to happen in real time, because the compromised navigation AI could not be trusted. When she got to the part about the structural risks and the sensor burnout, Faish made a small broken sound that was his species' version of a whimper, but he did not object, because the alternative was worse. "I will need direct access to the helm's navigation feed," Elise said. "I can run the calculations from the science station if Dr. Ossar will give me his console." Ossar was already standing up from his chair. "Take it," he said, and then more quietly, "How long have you been awake?" "It does not matter," Elise said, and she sat down at the science station and began linking her calculations to the helm. The next 9 hours were the longest of her life. The gentle orbit swung toward the stellar fragment, and the nebula around them grew thicker and darker, and the ship's systems began to protest. Proximity warnings, density alerts, temperature fluctuations, as the hull absorbed more and more radiation from the surrounding cloud. At hour 3, the Vorathi Drift Harvester seemed to realize that its prey was deviating from the expected path, and the subtle gravitational pulses stopped being subtle. The ship shuddered as something massive in the fog behind them began pushing harder, trying to force them back on course. "It knows," Yishra said from the tactical station, her claws gripping the edge of the display. Stay on course, Elise said, without looking up from her calculations, her fingers moving across the console in a blur that Dr. Ossar watched from the side of the bridge with an expression that he would later describe as medically concerning. At hour 5, the harvester dropped all pretense. It appeared on the long-range sensors as a shape so large that the display had to zoom out twice to fit it on the screen. A dark mass moving through the nebula like a mountain that had learned to swim, broadcasting no hails, no warnings, no communication of any kind. Just a targeting frequency that painted the gentle orbit's hull in invisible light. Faish began reciting something in his native language that Elise recognized as a Dothani prayer. For the dead. Not yet, Elise said firmly, and her voice carried across the bridge, and Faish stopped and looked at her. And she looked back at him with eyes that were red from exhaustion, and hard, with something that was not anger, but was certainly its close relative. Not yet, Lieutenant. At hour 7 they reached the stellar fragment, and Elise began feeding the helm officer the real-time calculations, a constant stream of numbers that adjusted for the gravity well's pull, the nebula's density, the ship's mass, the engine output, all of it changing every second, all of it needing to be perfect, because a margin of error of more than half a degree would either send them crashing into the fragment or slingshotting into the deep nebula with no way out. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking for hours, but she made them work anyway because she did not have the luxury of falling apart. The engine burn lasted 4 minutes and 18 seconds, and during those 4 minutes and 18 seconds the hull groaned and the lights flickered, and the sensor arrays on the port side overloaded and went dark one by one like candles being snuffed out. And the ship swung around the stellar fragment in a curve so tight that the artificial gravity stuttered, and everyone on the bridge grabbed their stations to keep from sliding sideways. And then they were through. The nebula thinned, and open space appeared on the forward display, black and clean and empty. And the helm officer shouted something that was half laughter and half disbelief. And behind them, the Vorathi drift harvester's signal began to fade, as the massive vessel found itself unable to match their trajectory through the dense nebula it had tried to use as a cage. FTL window available, the helm officer called. Jump, Captain Vaughn said, and the stars stretched, and the ship lurched, and the nebula vanished, and they were gone. Elise finished her last calculation and confirmed on her screen that the jump was clean and the course was safe, and the harvester was no longer on their sensors. Then she put her hands flat on the console and lowered her head between her arms, and the bridge went blurry around her. And someone was saying her name, but it sounded very far away. And the last thing she thought, before her body finally surrendered to the exhaustion it had been fighting for 32 hours, was that the cubs were safe in the secure bay, wrapped in thermal blankets. And that was enough. That was enough. She collapsed at her station, and the bridge crew stood around her in silence, and not one of them knew what to say about the human who had saved all of their lives by simply refusing to sleep. Elise opened her eyes, and did not know where she was for several long seconds that stretched like warm taffy between sleep and waking. The ceiling above her was white, and the light was soft, and the air smelled like the mineral antiseptic that the ship's medical bay used, and she was lying on something flat and firm with a thin blanket pulled up to her collarbone. She turned her head, and Dr. Ossar was standing beside her bed, reviewing a medical display with the slow, careful attention that his species brought to everything. And when he saw her eyes open, he let out a long breath through his gill slits that fogged faintly in the cool air. 20 hours, he said, answering the question she had not yet asked. You have been unconscious for 20 hours, and before that, you were awake for approximately 32 hours with no rest period. Which, he paused, and she could see him choosing his words with the precision of someone diffusing a device. Elise blinked and tried to sit up, and her body informed her through a chorus of aches and stiffness that sitting up was going to be a negotiation rather than a decision. "What do you mean?" she said, her voice rough. Ossar set down his medical display and faced her fully, his four-fingered hands clasped in front of him, in the posture that Prillians used when they were delivering information they considered deeply important. "I mean that I have reviewed the biological profiles of every species currently serving in the Galactic Union," he said. "Over 300 species, Dr. Marin, and of those 300 species, not a single one possesses the biological capacity to remain at full cognitive function for 32 continuous hours under high-stress conditions, without entering some form of involuntary shutdown." He paused again. "Not one except humans." Elise did not know what to say to that, so she said, "We just call it pulling." "An all-nighter." Ossar stared at her for a moment, and then made the soft bubbling sound that was the Prillian equivalent of disbelieving laughter. "You have a casual name for it," he said. "Your species does this often enough that you have a casual name for it." "It is not that impressive," Elise said. "You experienced mild cardiac arrhythmia from stimulant consumption," Ossar said, ticking items off on his fingers. "Severe sleep deprivation past the threshold that would render any Prillian comatose. Muscle fatigue in your hands and forearms consistent with 12 continuous hours of fine motor activity, and cortisol levels that should have triggered a total cognitive collapse approximately 6 hours before you actually lost consciousness." He looked at her with an expression that she could only describe as scientific horror. "Your body was shutting down system by system, and you just kept working. How did you do that?" Elise thought about it. "Involuntary shutdown," she said. "We just keep going until we cannot go anymore, and then we sleep for a very long time, and wake up and do it again." Ossar was quiet for a moment, and then he said very softly, "That is terrifying." And Elise was not sure if he meant it as a compliment, but she chose to take it as one. The door to the medical bay opened, and Captain Vaughn entered, his tall insectoid frame angling sideways to fit through the doorway that had been designed for shorter species. And he walked to her bedside with the precise measured steps that Selene used in formal situations. "Dr. Marin," he said, and his voice was different from the last time she had heard it. There was something in the tone that had not been there before, something that sounded almost warm, which was remarkable, because the Selene were not a species known for warmth. "Captain," she said, "I will be brief, because I understand you need continued rest," he said. "Incident directly prevented the destruction of this vessel, and the deaths of 340 crew members and dependents, including 47 children." He paused, and his mandibles moved in the pattern that meant he was weighing something carefully. "I was wrong to dismiss your initial report, and I have logged a formal commendation in your service record, along with a personal note accepting responsibility for the delay in response." Elise had not expected that. Selene captains were not known for admitting errors, and the fact that Vaughn had put it in writing meant something significant in his culture. "Additionally," he continued, "I would like to offer you a permanent bridge-level advisory position. Your title would be Senior Threat Analyst, and you would have standing authorization to flag anomalies directly to the command crew without going through intermediate review. You are giving me permission to wake you up in the middle of the night?" "I am giving you permission to do what you were already going to do," Vaughn said, and there was something in the way his compound eyes shifted that she was almost certain was humor. She accepted. Vaughn nodded once, and left the medical bay with the same precise steps, and Elise lay back on her pillow and stared at the ceiling, and felt very tired, and very grateful, and very much like she wanted to see 3 specific small furry faces. She did not have to wait long. The door opened again 20 minutes later, and Commander Yishra stood in the doorway, her dark fur catching the medical bay's soft light, her amber eyes fixed on Elise with the same unreadable intensity that she always carried. But she was not alone. 3 shapes pushed past her legs, and scrambled across the medical bay floor, with the graceless enthusiasm that only children of any species could produce. Claws clicking, and fur rippling, and small voices making sounds that were half words and half pure excitement. Ruck reached the bed first because his legs were longest, and he reared up and put his front paws on the edge of the mattress, and looked at Elise with those large reflective eyes, and said, "You are awake," in a voice that held so much relief it made her chest hurt. "I am awake," she said. Senna was next, jumping up onto the bed with an agility that sent the thin blanket sliding to the floor, and she pressed her silver-tipped head against Elise's shoulder, and made a low, rumbling sound that Elise had read about in her studies, but had never heard in person. A Velhari bonding vocalization, the sound their species made when they were confirming a connection with someone they considered family. Tal was last, because his legs were short and the bed was high, and he could not quite make the jump, so Elise reached down and lifted him, all 30 pounds of warm, round cub, and set him on the bed beside her, and he immediately curled into the space between her arm and her ribs, as if he had been designed to fit there. The 3 cubs arranged themselves around her, the same way they had arranged themselves around her console. Rook on the outside facing the door, Senna pressed close, Tal in the middle. And the medical cot was not built for 1 human and 3 Velhari cubs, but they made it work, because comfort is not about space, it is about presence. "We knew," Rook said, and his voice was serious in the way that children's voices are serious when they are saying something they believe completely. "We knew you would not let anything bad happen." Elise opened her mouth to say something, and found that she could not, because there was a thickness in her throat that had nothing to do with dehydration. So she just put her arms around as many cubs as she could reach, and held on. Commander Yishra watched from the doorway, and she did not come closer, because this moment was not hers, and she knew it. Said quietly, "When cubs choose a guardian outside of their family pack, it is considered Resh Gavel, a sacred bond. It means they have recognized something in that person that goes beyond species or obligation, something that their instincts tell them is permanent and true." She paused. "My cubs chose you, Elise, on the first night, before any of us knew what was coming, before you had saved anyone, before you had done anything at all, except sit at your console and let 3 frightened children sleep beside you." Her amber eyes glistened in the medical bay light. "They knew what you were before the rest of us did." "What am I?" Elise asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. "You are the one who stays awake," Yishra said simply, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. The cubs fell asleep against her within minutes, their breathing synchronizing the way it always did when they felt safe, their warm weight pressing into her from 3 directions, their furs soft under her hands. And Elise lay there in the medical bay of a ship she had saved, surrounded by children who were not her species, but who had decided she was theirs, and she closed her eyes and let herself rest at last. 2 days later, the gentle orbit limped into Union Station 17, with half its sensor arrays burned out, and a hull stress report that made the station engineers swear in 4 languages. And the crew filed their after-action reports, and the Union Admiralty opened a formal investigation into the Varathi presence in the nebula corridor. The official incident report was 12 pages long and contained detailed technical analysis of the drift harvester's herding methodology, sensor data logs, navigation records, and a structural assessment of the damage sustained during the slingshot maneuver. Under the section labeled Key Personnel, Incident Resolution, there was a single entry. It read, Dr. Elise Marin, Human, Xenobiologist. Reclassified, Senior Threat Analyst. Action. Remained at station for 32 continuous hours without relief. Identified Vorathi drift harvester threat from anomalous signal data dismissed by senior staff. Calculated manual escape trajectory through high-density nebula. Executed real-time navigational recalculations during slingshot maneuver. Status at conclusion of incident, unconscious. Below this entry, in the margin of the official document where no annotation should have been, someone had written a single line in Velhari script. The flowing curved letters that looked like claw marks left in soft earth. The station archivist who processed the report did not speak Velhari, so she called a translator, and the translator read the line, and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "It says, the cubs slept beside her. That is all you need to know." The archivist asked if it should be removed, since it was not part of the official record. No. She said, leave it. She said some things are more true than official records, and this was one of them. And somewhere aboard the gentle orbit, as it sat in dock being repaired, in a crew quarters that had been quietly reassigned to be closer to the Velhari family suite, a human woman slept in a bed that was too small for her, and 3 alien cubs who had climbed through the open door and piled on top of her because they could not sleep without the sound of her heartbeat. And she did not mind, and she did not send them away, and the night was quiet, and the stars outside the station window were very bright, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel.